Hi, I'm Steve, and I'm an expert on the European communities. And if you live in the UK like I do, someone has likely said to you that the common market was all about trade when we joined. But is that true? Not really, as we shall see. It's generally recognised that the start of political development in the European community was the introduction of political consultation in 1959. Hansard records Edward Heath explaining the state of affairs and how the Six are considering more formal consultation. Actually, very formal. Very shortly after, the Bonn Declaration of 1961 declared their wish to give shape to the will for political union already implicit in the treaties. And that led to the attempted negotiation of a treaty which ended up being called European Union. Since the UK were joining, they had to show their hand. Edward Heath made an important speech agreeing it should be political and that his government wants to join the political union at the same time as they join the European Economic Community. Unfortunately, the negotiations stalled, the UK's application was vetoed, and the political consultation meeting wasn't held again for several years. There were various rumours that political union was just about to take off in the mid-60s, but none of them actually happened. The big political change came from the resolution on the invasion of Czechoslovakia, which was unanimously voted on in September 1968. 1 year later at the Hague summit, ministers of foreign affairs were asked to investigate ways of achieving progress in the matter of political unification. And so they went away and they talked about political union. The outcome being d'Avignon, otherwise known as the Luxembourg Report. On this, the political committee was created with political directors, and work started on the member states working together in international institutions like the United Nations. It also established the meeting of the Six and the meeting of the Ten. It was at this time the communities established their first joint foreign policy, confirming their approval of Resolution 242 of the Security Council. It was not that long before the leaders of Europe began calling for a summit to discuss the future. Edward Heath saying one of the first priorities should be foreign policy, and it is inevitable that defence cooperation will come from that. At the time, that was a very common argument for Edward Heath.
Because cooperation in economic and political fields may lead to closer cooperation in defence.
In November 1971, the summit is agreed between the Ten. On the agenda is the development of close political union. In an interview made after signing the Treaty of Accession, Edward Heath spoke of the future of the meeting of the Ten and how developing foreign policy was a high priority.
In discussions about foreign policy, it's been the Six who met and had a discussion, then the Four joined them. Well, I hope now that we can meet from the beginning as 10, because that's what it's going to be like. We're in a world of superpowers, and what matters to Europe is, in fact, it has very little voice or influence in what the superpowers do. And this is where I think we've got a very high priority, and where again the summit comes in, to work out how Europe, 250 million people, is going to be able to speak with one voice and influence international affairs.
Days after the interview, it was announced that the meeting of the Six would be abolished and it would now just be the meeting of the Ten. The Conservative Party conference was held a week before the summit, during which the Defence Secretary spoke of a nuclear force in Europe. This led to the leader of the opposition, Harold Wilson, demanding to know if Heath was going to announce a nuclear army at the summit. Finally, after a year of discussion, the leaders of the future enlarged community begin arriving in Paris. The Daily Mirror described it as the day that makes history. From the government notes, we learned that political cooperation had been mainly between the Six, and while still new, that in previous years voting on the Middle East had been different, but now the Six were voting together. Edward Heath calls for a common foreign policy, not just reacting to events, but for the creation of medium and long-term foreign policies. And it was agreed and announced along with monetary union.
And we want to try and get economic and monetary union within Western Europe by 1980. Now, inevitably, I think, on the political side, the formation of common foreign policy on various issues which arise will take longer.
The Sunday People reported this as Heath wins Battle of Trafalgar Day. Mr. Heath wanted two main things from the conference: progress towards a common foreign policy and satisfaction about regional policy. He got both. But that isn't the main story of the summit. That is European Union by 1980. On October the 21st, 1972, in front of 700 journalists, 9 leaders of Europe shared a single platform to announce their intention to create the European Union in less than 10 years. They called for a report to be submitted by the community no later than the end of 1975. By July 1973, the foreign policy is being developed as Edward Heath had hoped.
We can see that the practice of proceeding by agreement on major issues of foreign policy is beginning to take root. As Western Europe establishes its unity, the Nine will be able to reach a joint position with increasing speed and effectiveness when the situation requires it, in response to any given international crisis, or better still, in anticipation of one.
By November, the European communities had set out a formal declaration on the Middle East. Another summit is arranged for Copenhagen at the end of 1973, with the plan to have multiple summits going forward, while the member states await for the report on European Union.
As well as giving further impetus to a common European foreign policy, these regular summit meetings will, I hope, discuss the strategic development of the community. But they will not and cannot replace the Council of Ministers. Nor will these summits be any substitute for the arduous and complicated task which the Paris summit allocated to the institutions of the community, the preparation of a report on European Union before the end of 1975. That report will need to be the result of a creative and cooperative effort by the Council, the Commission and the Parliament, if we are to go forward with the transformation of the whole complex of our relations into a union in accordance with the decision we have already taken.
So it can be argued it was political from 1959 or 1967 if you want to go from when the meeting was reconvened. You can argue it was political when the Six officially announced the intention was political union in 1961. You can argue it was political from the creation of the political committee and the political directors in 1970, or the first common foreign policy position in 1971. You can even argue it was always political because the Parliament had a political affairs committee. That committee had been inherited from the European Coal and Steel Community. It had worked on the first political union attempt, the European Political Community, way back in 1953. But you can't argue it wasn't political in 1973. At the time the UK, Ireland and Denmark joined, it was a project to create a European Union by 1980. It would be fair to say the foreign policy was very simple on the 1st of January 1973, but by the end of 1973 it is very similar to what was set down in Maastricht, and not a million miles away from what we have today. Anyway, that's my video, and thanks for watching.